it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. I cut out my eyes to stop myself going mad. By Daniel Lorn. Part 1. It had never occurred to me that so many forbidden and unimaginable desires lurked beyond the veil of existence. For years I'd suffered in ignorance of this revelation, allowing my forgotten appetites to rot away within the depths of my blood. Although blind within the darkness, these cravings desperately longed to be observed. But now they stirred. Now they danced gracefully on the surface of my sanity, having floated up from the depths unexplored. You can be assured that the words I speak about the unpredictable brutality of my nature are sincere. I also wish you to understand that I do not consider myself as mad. And the following recollection may inspire you to open your eyes to the secrets I am now accustomed to. You may even share the same notions and illicit urges as I. We are all creatures of flesh, you see. Open your eyes. I use these words with a sense of irony, as it was only yesterday that I removed my own eyes with a broken piece of glass. Well, it hurt like hell. But pain is just pain, and there are worse things to endure than that. What's important to note is that any sane person would have done the same thing as me under the right circumstances. You will likely gather from my story that I'm probably not that much different from you, and that we may share a few things in common. Growing up, I was privy to a relatively normal lifestyle. As a child, nothing about my upbringing was notably different to most, and I was raised in a fairly decent neighborhood. A mixture of young families and pensioners filled my estate's mid-terrace and semi-detached houses. It was a rather dull place to live. I always found it challenging to make friends and always preferred my own company to others. My parents tended to leave me to my own devices. They seemed quite satisfied that I'd rather stay home reading books and playing video games instead of running around outdoors in the fresh air. At school, my classmates disregarded me, which suited me fine as I didn't have much to say to anyone. When my parents finally decided to move into retirement care, I was given the keys to the family home and managed to gain employment working behind a computer screen. After a while, I faded into the background of life's canvas, and nothing ever seemed to happen out of the ordinary. Well, until last year, that is. A young couple moved in next door to my terraced house. A tall blonde woman and a short but rather stocky-looking man who looked much too old for his partner. She was miles out of his league, young, pretty, and someone who carried a certain air of grace with her. On the other hand, he had the appearance of an untamed pit bull terrier. Intimidating and aloof, he'd race around in his fancy car and designer tracksuits as though he owned the place. I fancied that she was attracted more to his wallet than anything else he had to offer. Within a few months of their arrival, several complaints were reported to the police about the frequent heated and drunken rows that would exhale from that house at night like a disgusting smell. However, their arguments never bothered me, and soon I became transfixed with their regular altercations. I'd skulk in the silence of my bedroom every Friday night for the evening's entertainment to commence. It usually started with the husband storming home from the pub just before midnight with a cold fish supper for his beloved wife. She'd pretend to be asleep at first, but she couldn't keep that charade up for very long. He'd soon grow bored and slam the bedroom door closed before stomping down the stairs. And I'd wait patiently because I knew that hubby would burst back in through that door only moments later. And that's when the real fun would begin. I always had to cover my mouth to conceal my rising laughter when she finally reacted to his taunts. She'd stand up for herself occasionally, but he was much too powerful for her. Sometimes I'd hear him angrily force-feeding her that cold fish supper as she pleaded with him to stop. The sounds of flesh being slapped and the crunch of fists on the wall would typically mark the crescendo of the evening, and I would lurk on the other side of that wall, biting my fist in absolute elation as I overheard the violence unfolding. From what I could gather, the husband was convinced his wife was sleeping with everyone on the street whilst he was out at the pub. I would cackle in elation at this. Clearly he didn't know the neighborhood very well. The only exciting thing to happen in recent years was the old guy across the road shouting at some local kids that had kicked a ball into his beloved garden. And even that was grounds for the police to be notified. Everyone seemed blissfully unaware of reality's surreptitious songs, which now offered me my regular weekly fix. Sure, I'd watched my fair share of horror movies and crime documentaries, but this was very different. This was happening right next door, and I would ache in anticipation every day and night until the weekend finally arrived. But eventually, like so many other glorious things in our lives that we take for granted, it all came to an end. One Friday evening, my neighbours were fighting again, whilst I loitered in my usual position with my ear pushed tightly against the wall. But as I sat there completely naked and concupiscent, I soon realized that things were getting unusually fiery on this particular occasion. Their shouting was growing louder and angrier by the second. The rising intensity of this new level of aggression matched my emerging arousal, and I shook with delight at the beautiful sounds of this somewhat volatile interaction. Their argument eventually transferred out from the bedroom, and I could hear the wife screaming that she was leaving her husband. He bellowed furiously and raced down the stairs after her. A flurry of heavy slaps and angry, undecipherable shouts echoed through the wall as they brawled on the stairs, and I shrieked in absolute euphoria at this. Finally, the front door slammed open and I raced over to the window, absolutely thrilled at the delights I'd soon be able to witness. Upon sneaking my head between the curtains, I could see that almost every other neighbour was following suit. Curious eyes peered out of high windows at the rain-filled streets below. The volatile nature of the couple's relationship spared no detail for their audience, as that house spat them out onto the road like guts from a rotten stomach. While they wrestled in the garden, bellowing obscenities at each other, as onlookers watched from the safety of their own darkened bedrooms. Usually the husband's physicality would overpower his wife, but he was in a particularly drunken state that evening. Consequently, she managed to hold her own and fought back with venomous aggression to knock him to the floor as everyone watched on silently. Like any other person would have done, I attempted to pleasure myself at the spectacle, but much to my annoyance, the police soon arrived on the scene to spoil the fun. Sighing in frustration at the closure of the evening's entertainment, I eventually retired to my bed and was soon fast asleep. As I opened my eyes, a heavy sound seemed to have spilt over from my dream. It was loud enough to be heard over the raging storm that threatened to blow the windows in. The thumping then paused for a moment as I eased myself up to sit on the edge of my mattress. But then it returned, loud, violent, and heavy. The rain lashed hard against the house, and the furious wind caused the entire building to shudder. Still, I was more interested in the disturbance radiating from next door. Eager for more fulfillment at my neighbour's expense, I quickly got out of bed and carefully placed my ear against the wall. I could identify only one voice from the other side, the husband. He was murmuring words I couldn't quite decipher, as something repeatedly slammed hard and wet into the concrete that separated my bedroom from theirs. The thumping vibrations massaged against my bare skin, and I trembled with appreciation. Content within the moment, my heavily beating heart began to match the dull rhythm as it intensified. A broad smile tightened across my face as I noticed the arousal from earlier returning. I envisaged the husband punching that wall, his knuckles broken and bruised, as his wife huddled with the covers pulled up tight to her neck. The thought of her terror always pleased me tremendously, but I couldn't hear her whimpers or indeed her screams. I pushed my ear harder against the wall, but it all went silent for a moment, and that's when I could hear something approaching from the distance outside. My blood ran cold as I recognized the sound of police sirens blaring furiously towards the estate. Concerned about my merriment being spoiled again, I implored them to head elsewhere, but within moments they were tearing into our street. My heart leapt into my mouth as I noticed lights flashing through the haze of rainfall that blurred outside in the night. I cursed at this unwelcome disruption to my gratification. Creeping over to the window with a tennis ball-sized lump in my throat, I noticed several figures exiting a police van before banging on my neighbour's door. Almost as though in acknowledgement, the wall began to boom and thump with much more intensity than before. The officers responded by forcibly gaining entry to the house. A brief struggle ensued, and I tried to translate the frantic words through the wall, but the boisterous wind and rain made that impossible. I watched and listened for a while before an ambulance pulled up outside to receive a stretcher from next door, covered with a plain white sheet. Next, I could see my neighbour, the husband, ushered into the back of a police riot van before it pulled away and into the night, closely followed by the ambulance. A few figures returned to the house and closed the door behind them. I waited for several hours, but all that remained was a calm serenity underneath the heavy rainfall. A poignant, underlying silence that brought with it the notion of a climax. A blanket of tranquility had fallen over the neighborhood, which washed away all that was left of my arousal. I felt sick as my body purged itself of any pent-up enthusiasm, and I immediately started to feel withdrawn and depressed. I screamed angrily into my pillow that night until I finally fell asleep. A few days later, the news of what happened next door finally reached the public, and it was those details that reinvigorated my previous condition. My neighbour had awakened inebriated but lucid after the initial confrontation in the garden. Overwhelmed with rage about his wife fighting back in front of their neighbours, he had utterly lost control and tried to strangle her as she slept. However, she awoke, and a brief struggle occurred as he wildly grabbed at her neck, desperate to choke the life from her. During the altercation, she managed to call the police, who could hear everything after the phone dropped to the floor. She eventually managed to stand up, but he was right behind her, pursuing her through the darkness like an animal chasing its prey. After brutally punching her to the floor, he shoved her head against the wall. He repeatedly stomped on her until he was content that she could fight back no more. A final act of violence to end a somewhat fraught marriage. I fancied he was acting out his innate desire for gratification, whilst I lurked nearby, frantically exploring mine. It seemed we were connected somehow, and tuned in to the same frequency. It's easier to blame such occurrences on alcohol and domestic violence rather than face the stark reality that something special is hidden inside us, usually unnoticed by most. And without an appropriate level of conditioning, our true selves could be left to rot dormant forever in the darkness. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be nothing but honest with my recollection, well, at least as much as mere words will allow. What happened next door afflicted me as though it were an uncontrollable and rampant virus searing through my veins. Something insidious had been disturbed within the vast ocean of my subconscious. As I recalled that crashing and banging from next door, I visualized the wife's mangled head bursting and cracking under the hefty weight of her husband's foot. And all of this happened as I lurked and listened nearby. I envisioned the cartilage in her nose crunching as it was mashed into her pretty face. The force of his repeated blows rained upon her as the storm outside battered houses, cars, and trees, both man and nature unrelenting with their aggression. And finally, the life seeping from her wounds as death's vibrant and magnificent colors washed over her. Each sadistic thought translated into my mind as wonderful and pleasing images of blood flowing from her numerous injuries. My heart pumped furiously at a force that could have fired the engine of a steam train, and a wave of electricity shot underneath my scalp. As my lungs expanded greedily and rapidly, I continued to paint a picture in my mind of what had happened next door. Overwhelmed by amplifying exhilaration, I nearly passed out, but then I suddenly became conscious of a potent motivation stirring within me. It was as though I'd been injected with pure adrenaline. Not once did I consider my response to any of this strange. Instead, it is odd that I hadn't accessed this intoxicating sensation before. I felt reborn. At that moment, I wondered what specific acclimatization was required for someone sane and rational as I to consider taking another person's life. This seemed undoubtedly the next logical progression to explore for those of us with a taste of the hidden secrets, the next level. These new tendencies made me physically sick at the notion of the life I'd begun to turn my back upon. I became repulsed at the thought of anyone else wasting their privileged existences trying to act normal whilst unwillingly masking their true selves from the world. The routine and empty charade of trying so desperately to fit in while seeking validation from others are hallmarks of narcissism. And narcissist I am not. Social validation is merely a poison that alters our perception of who we are. Educated and evolved human beings, now scrambling about in the darkness of society, seeking mundane employment just to pay the bills, striving for nothing more than a comfortable life whilst nurturing the next generation of robots, not humans. Gosh, just what on earth are they thinking? What on earth was I ever thinking? Social engineering and brainwashing are powerful distractions from the absolute truth, but I would be fooled no longer. It's undoubtedly insane to allow such abstract practices to stagnate us. And I, for one, am not insane. The melody of death from next door had affected every fibre within my soul, and now I had a longing for more. I craved to treat my other senses to the opulence of this new dimension. I started to look at life with a new sense of enlightenment, as though I now had access to a more robust lens than before. A unique lens that offered me a finite understanding of what was rational. Yeah, I was tuning in to a frequency that had awakened somewhere deep inside of my very soul. An unseen frequency that likely roams in every one of us. But just because something is unseen doesn't mean it's not there. It started to feel like a doorway had eased open somewhere, both nearby and far away at the exact same moment. Wherever this door led, I had no particular desire to close it. Neither did I have any conscious control of my newfound urges. Then a question appeared with absolute clarity, imprinted on my mind like words on a giant billboard. What does it feel like to kill someone? The more attention I offered the concept, the more my anticipation for the answer to the question intensified. I indulged myself repeatedly with self-pleasure as I played it out in my mind, trying to imagine the depths I could reach. I was nearing some kind of a void that promised to fuse flesh with a potent mixture of pleasure and anticipation, and even though I'd only stepped into the shallow waters of this new dimension, they were abundant with flavor. My life had been supercharged with a new and enhanced level of direction. Before stumbling upon this revelation, my day had consisted of little more than the mundane. I'll spare you the details, as I find it hard to commit them to conscious memory. It was as if I'd been looking through someone else's eyes and watching a movie that neither excited nor satisfied me, slowly going mad while struggling to conform to the acceptable rules of society. But not anymore. Since those deepest desires had flourished, I spent countless hours searching and rejoicing in all that the internet offers for those of us with such cravings. But that only served to whet my appetite. Some of the executions and torture videos I found merely served to arouse me sexually, but it wasn't enough. I needed a deeper kind of fulfillment. I had to know what it felt like to be the executioner, to swing the blade, to commit someone willingly to the grave. Oh, my eyes ache. The blood is all but dried, but my body is drained. The wounds will never heal, and likely I will soon become privy to whatever skulks behind the realms of existence, something I'm wildly enthusiastic about exploring. I can't help but smile as my mortality reaches me with long, sinewy fingers, but at least I have a story to tell, at least I have lived. His name was Flesh Creature 21, at least that was his online handle. It would be a mistake to place your actual name and details on those sites. I met him on social media via a shared interest in tastes of, let's say, a forbidden kind. We hadn't yet connected in the flesh, however I had managed to do some investigative work to track him down. It didn't take long to identify that his real name was Dennis Palmer. After that, I uncovered his phone number, home address, and even where he worked. Well, Dennis was kind of special. I flowed to him as though water following a stream. Our tastes were so similar and profound that I imagined him as a brother of sorts. Like me, he was tall and slim with short, dark brown hair. He had slight acne scarring across both cheeks and dark rings round his eyes. He probably spent too much time on the computer and eating junk food, something I could level with. His life was as equally mundane as mine had only recently been, and I developed an absolute obsession with him before long. Dennis was something of a tourist. He would log on each night simply to inspect the variety of exotic treats and videos on the dark web. Never one to get involved in any of the discussion about the latest snuff movie being uploaded, Dennis would just silently observe. He preferred everyone else to do the dirty work while he just watched from the safety of his room, just as I'd done whilst listening to my neighbours through the wall. I noticed a pattern emerging as I examined his online presence and movements. I was soon aware of when he left his house in the morning and what route he followed to work. I stalked him. Every day for several months, I would ride the train to the station near where Dennis lived. Upon disembarking the train, I would walk the remainder of the journey to his street. I would always arrive early for my ritual and stand directly across from his house at the bus stop. It was possible from that vantage point to see him exiting his front door at 8 a.m. He was none the wiser to my existence either, as standing at the bus stop made me blend in. I also made a point of regularly altering my appearance and clothing, just in case he started to smell a rat. Once Dennis was outside his house, he turned left and headed down the street towards a large park. He'd usually stop for refreshments at a cafe called Nuts About Coffee. His choice of drink was a cinnamon latte with extra cinnamon, something I was partial to myself. Then he would stroll through the park, a journey that usually took him no more than 5 minutes. The park welcomed Dennis and me every morning with the subtle aromas of pine and vanilla from the flourishing green trees and blossoming yellow bushes. In the warm glow of the morning sun, the park was abundant with the songs of wildlife, but Dennis showed no interest in any of the thriving nature surrounding him. He instead preferred to keep his head down low as he trudged along, paying no attention to the world around him. On the other hand, my senses were on high alert, and I had begun to notice absolutely everything. Dennis always walked along a wide path that skirted past a small lake to the other side. Over the months, I analysed his every movement through those park grounds. I wouldn't just follow him, though. Oh, no. I sometimes arrived much earlier to set myself up on one of the benches in the public gardens to wave at him. Sensing his arrival, I wouldn't even look up as he approached me. I didn't want to stir any suspicion, you see. I also jogged past him occasionally to see how close I could get to him, but I didn't even acknowledge him. My unconscious instinct would always pick up on his presence, and I didn't even need to look in his direction to know he was there. I even recognized his fragrance as well, a sweet and tangy aftershave that did little to mask his unwashed armpits. It's safe to say that I was entirely tuned into everything about Dennis Palmer. It satisfied me immensely that he didn't seem to notice his new travelling companion, and that I knew his every move. Dennis would get on the number 51 bus to town upon departing the park. The bus ride took just 20 minutes, 30 if traffic was heavy, and he'd sit on the same seat every time, halfway down the bus on the right-hand side. Or at least he'd tried to. I'd always squeal with delight when someone had already taken his usual seat, and could always recognize the moment his demeanor changed. His blood would boil if he didn't get his favorite chair, and Dennis would glare menacingly at whoever dared to sit there. Thin droplets of perspiration would glaze his forehead as he struggled to contain himself, and his face would turn a deep shade of red. Any slight deviation from his routine would utterly ruin his entire day. Once I decided to sit in his chair on the bus to await his arrival, to see what it would be like to experience his reaction for myself. As soon as he arrived and noticed me in his seat, he scowled at me with absolute malice. When his eyes met mine, I was significantly taken aback, and a strange recognition transferred between us. As exhilarating as it was, it had me filled with an uncomfortable sensation of impending doom. When I returned home that night, I vomited uncontrollably for about an hour. Since then, whenever I considered that energy transfer between Dennis and me, my heart would flutter as I became incensed with an unexpected and terrible rage. The sensation was utterly overwhelming. It caused me to feel both sick and exhausted at the same time. His eyes had somehow triggered an illness within me, as though his presence was nothing more than a virus. My intentions were initially unclear at the beginning of my secret pursuit of Dennis Palmer. To be honest, I wanted to spend some time nurturing my anticipation to ensure he'd be a suitable victim. But after meeting eyes with him on that bus, it was almost as though my clandestine game was up. I could not allow him to become privy to my obsession. I would not let him. The only thing that would take away my toxic rage and control my deep sickness was the idea of killing this person. I became electrified at the thought of his pending demise, and at the same time my body felt ravaged by a deep and rampant longing, one that could only be satisfied by ingesting a singular source of nourishment, a deep and rooted urge to remove Dennis Palmer from his uninspired existence. An existence I both loved and hated at the same time. Our destinies had crossed, and there was no way of turning back. I was committed. My tactics changed after that revelation, and I began to pursue him from much further away for fear of being recognized. My movements became more covert, and I decided to stalk him in the darkness. His evening routine was as banal as it was in the day, and he began to disgust me. After work, Dennis would leave the front door from his office blocks and head straight across the road to buy chips from the Four Seasons takeaway. I scoffed. I'd used that takeaway before, but usually went for the cheeseburger. I'd started to compare each choice he made with my own. After his meal, he'd wait at the bus stop for the number 51 bus, which would drop him directly across the road from the park. It was tangibly quieter at night, and someone had sabotaged the lights, which meant it was conveniently pitch black inside. It was easy to conceal myself in the park as I waited for Dennis to wander through to the other side each evening. I would groan with excitement from where I lurked as he neared me. Concealed within the bushes, I'd wait patiently, sometimes for hours. Now and again, I followed him from behind the trees, always just out of sight. As I watched him, I would tremble and shake with silent laughter as I pondered my cunning plan. My anticipation escalated when I noticed he was starting to behave differently. Dennis usually walked, facing only the direction he was headed, with no care for the world around him. But more recently, his movement had become much more erratic than usual. He started to turn his head from side to side before entering the park, which was new. He stood just outside the gates to deliberate his venture through on one occasion, which was entirely out of character for him. Dennis was slightly reluctant to enter the park, his notion becoming more apparent every night. He seemed to be slowly becoming aware of his fate, just as I was of mine. As I said earlier, we're all creatures of flesh, but something deeper connects us all, something unseen by many. I felt a pleasurable stirring within my heart as I share these words with you. The euphoria is almost enough to dull the pulsating pain from my ruptured eyes as I now contemplate those final, special moments. That special night. I was already on the bus when Dennis sat down a few seats in front of me, and he was right on time as always. The aroma from his recent portion of chips pervaded my nostrils as it filtered from his old puffer jacket. I watched him from the corner of my eye, and my heart was steady, poised. It never missed a beat. His body language had most definitely altered. Something about the way he moved was all wrong. He was restless throughout this entire bus journey, and it seemed like something was quite obviously playing on his mind. I began to sense fear in him. Well, as I said before, I was tuned in. Something new festered between the scent of his cheap aftershave and the vinegar from his chips. It was potent, and I could almost taste it. It was like an old, well-used sock, saturated in thick, oily sweat. I knew it came from him, and it satisfied me with an intensity I hadn't felt before. A broad grin stretched across my face, and a slight murmur escaped my lips. The noise of the bus, as it rocked and groaned, was just enough to cover my rising excitement. The more I breathed in this new scent, the more aroused I became. I had to close my eyes and bite my tongue for fear of screaming out in ecstasy. I almost misjudged the stop and had to quickly stand up to follow Dennis as he departed the bus. Stepping out onto the street as the doors closed behind me, I decided to sit on a bench to ponder my next maneuver. Something had wriggled into my mind from out of the night. A wild certainty which I can only describe as that moment of fight or flight. As though I was standing on a cliff edge, ready to jump into the unknown. My senses heightened to a new level, and it felt as though the world was closing in tight around me. Nervous energy bubbled within me like acid, and I could taste the metallic hint of my blood as I gritted my teeth together. The bus pulled away with a hiss, and I watched Dennis from my peripheral vision. Usually he would head straight across the street towards the park, but this time he hesitated. It was as though he couldn't decide whether to make the journey through the darkened park or avoid it altogether. Well, I prayed for the former. Choosing neither option, it seemed, he suddenly turned towards a pub that faced the park from the other side of the road. It was a pub he'd frequented once or twice before, for little more than a soft drink at the bar before he continued his journey home. Initially, I panicked, but soon realized that his need for refreshment would buy me extra time to hide in the park and quietly await his presence. As always, I'd conscientiously planned everything out, so I was ready for the moment to present itself. Tonight was the night. Part 2. I waited until he was deep inside the bar before deciding it would be too much of a wasted opportunity to not try and see how close I could get to him. To stand near him in the bar without him noticing me. Well, you must understand that I wanted to relish this moment. Various scents, some fresh and others musk, permeated my lungs as I entered the pub. To keep my burning desires at bay, I practiced deep breathing techniques, which I employed to control my creeping desires. Perfume and aftershave sprayed heavily over casual clothing did little to mask the smell of smoke and piss, which intensified as I approached the bar. I could see Dennis through the busy crowd ordering his drink. I'd never seen him with friends, something else we both had in common, and so I had little concern that he would engage in conversation with anyone. As I approached him, I gazed at the back of his head and dared him to look around and see me. I wanted him to acknowledge somehow the potent mixture of rage and excitement I exuded. He stirred a little, but didn't turn in my direction. If such a thing as telepathy existed, he would have left that bar immediately and headed straight to the police. I positioned myself next to him at the bar and casually ordered a drink. I wanted to stand beside him and enjoy my drink without glancing in his direction as I marked my territory. More importantly, I wanted him to notice my blazing aura and recognize it later when we met for the first and final time, flesh to flesh. Choking back a giggle, I continued my approach. Dennis quietly sipped his drink as I maneuvered into position behind him. I ordered a small Coke, more for a prop than anything else, to help me blend in. But in his presence, as the blood rushed furiously through my body, I began to feel lightheaded and nauseous. The cold and sweet drink was a welcome respite to my condition. We stood side by side at the bar as though companions. The ambience of the pub was undisturbed by the unseen certainty that exuded from us both as we drank. Groups of friends engaged in murmured conversation as frantic bar staff rushed around to keep the thirsty clientele happy. And there I stood, exactly where I wanted to be, poised and ready, soaking in the nourishment that exuded from Dennis Palmer's pores. I sucked the scent of his aftershave deep into my lungs, which caused my heart to pump with absolute ferocity. Fresh and minty, but not enough to mask the underlying smoky and meaty odor which oozed from his unlaundered clothing and decaying breath. I trembled violently with anticipation, and my body shivered, which caused me to panic for a moment. Part of me wanted Dennis to accept his fate, but at the same time I didn't wish him to become aware of my rising, undoubtedly palpable excitement. I didn't want to give the entire game away, you see, but he continued to gaze straight ahead, only occasionally lifting his glass lazily to his mouth to take a sip. It began to frustrate me. It perplexed me even. Here I was, his executioner, standing right beside him with a sickle, and he didn't even have the curiosity to acknowledge the certainty of his fate. Flesh is just flesh. Well, my rage became laced with searing adrenaline, and I had to take a few deep breaths to compose myself. I decided to try and force my sly plan into Dennis's subconscious one last time, just to give him an echo of a chance. I wanted him to be scared, and I craved to smell the depths of his fear. I yearned to feel and taste the life escaping him, and that's when I decided to use my bare hands to kill him later instead of using the hammer I'd hidden in the park. Yeah, I wanted to feel the energy leaving him as I bathed in the warm flavors of his demise. To fill my entire body with the poison of his terror would satisfy me immensely. I compelled him to sense those thoughts, but he remained absolutely and deathly still. There might as well have been a brick wall between us. And just like the one which had offered me a sanctuary to listen to the pleasing sounds of pain and fear from my neighbour several months earlier. Unluckily for Dennis, however, he had no such wall to hide behind. I shook my head mockingly before deciding it was time to leave the bar. It was time to get ready. I finished my drink before glancing back at Dennis, who remained utterly unfazed in his ignorance. Locked in his little world, he was oblivious to the reality around him. I scowled as a mixture of compulsion and delirium hit my brain like a generous shot of cheap whiskey. Just you wait, I murmured under my breath on departure from the vibrant climate of the bar to the quiet stillness of the night outside. My breath misted as it met the cold, but inside I burned like a furnace. Every fibre of my being was crammed with an unrelenting and menacing rage for Dennis Palmer. The warm, trembling excitement from earlier was hidden underneath this new layer of poised and frenzied wrath. How dare he not acknowledge me? The street was still and partially vacant outside. Across the road, the pitch blackness of the park looked terminally uninviting to the sparse amount of people who went about their business. No one seemed encouraged to enter wandering through at this hour of the night. For many, paranoia was hidden in the darkness, but I felt more alive than ever underneath its veil. I didn't want to waste another moment, so I jogged across the road and went straight through the open gate between the surrounding hedgerows. The park swallowed me under a protective cloak of darkness that denied entry to the weak beams of the surrounding streetlights. High trees blotted out occasional stray headlights from the passing cars. The murmurs of their engines were a dull white noise from within the enclosure of thick trees and dense bushes. Deep in the park, by the lake, was my destination. Far enough away from the buzz of the residential areas, it was perfect for what I had planned. I could feel a warm glow of excitement battling it out with the unrelenting rage in my stomach. It was a curious sensation, one I can sincerely recommend. I knew every inch of the park by heart. The lake was deep in the center of the public gardens, with numerous tree lines to hide in. I headed towards a tall and thick tree that commanded the area across from the lake. The tree loomed over several bushes, basking under its deep shadow, a prime position for me to await my prey. I crouched low and looked back in the direction of the park. Dennis would be arriving soon, and I remained deathly still. It was essential to stay relaxed and maintain control. I'd even rehearsed my crouching position so I wouldn't get stiff joints. That would slow me down. No, I was conditioned for this. I was calibrated right into this moment. The park itself was silent, fearful of uttering even the slightest breath. Only an occasional shuffling of the nocturnal wildlife disturbed the evening. And I waited. From a short distance away, the careful footsteps whispered in the darkness. It was like shambling at first, but then I could sense a presence that was trying its hardest not to be heard in the tranquility of the evening. Someone approached stealthily but deliberately. Closing my eyes, I focused on the sounds of the footfall, and the fire in my belly told me that Dennis Palmer was nearing my position. I knew the pace of his walk, and I could also recognize the rhythm of his breathing. The night was impenetrable beside the lake, but I had the advantage. My eyes were conditioned to this darkness, and I had the element of surprise. As Dennis continued his approach, I remained perfectly still, my breathing slow, measured, and steady. Dennis was only a few meters from where I crouched, poised like a coiled spring ready to go off. I would let him walk a little bit past me before I made my move. I wanted to smell those unlaundered clothes under a mask of cheap aftershave and the sweat draining from his pores just one last time before I acted. The smell of his fragrance eventually hit my lungs with aromatic citrus tones. A smile stretched across my cheeks and my body shuddered, but the scent of his unwashed and disgusting body caused me to become frenzied. Bloodlust consumed me as a red mist flashed in front of my eyes. Inebriated with previously unimaginable fury, I moved quickly and aggressively. My furious onslaught must have been deafening. Saliva dripped from my open mouth as I snarled and lashed out at Dennis, knocking him to the floor as he crunched awkwardly underneath my body. My hands repeatedly crashed violently onto his face, and his pathetic and useless resistance fueled my rage even further. Slapping his feeble arms to one side, I clasped my hands tightly around his throat. His slim neck pulsed and strained under my fierce grip, and I could finally smell his fear. That beautiful, unspoiled scent. It hit me hard and deep in the lungs, making me convulse. Feces, piss, and body odor drained from his pores as his dying, wretched body purged itself in retaliation. Dennis weakly lashed out with his arms as he tried to grab at me, but his efforts were useless. My eyes stretched wide enough to tear at the edges as I clamped down harder, using my body weight as leverage. His struggle weakened further, and his arms fell limply beside him. My jaw tightened with such a ferocity that it felt as though my teeth would snap, and my hands seemed to have grown more prominent as his neck tightened under my crunching grip. I worked with such an enhanced power that I could feel my fingers connect at both sides with his pitiful neck as I squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. Can't say how long I remained there, throttling his lifeless throat before I finally began to release my grip. I was far too dizzy and high on the fumes of his demise to worry, and at that moment I wasn't concerned about getting caught. It was as though I wanted someone to find us tangled up in that horrific scene, but not of course to seek validation. I just wanted the moment to be authentic. Standing above my victim, I smiled proudly, taking a huge breath to recharge my lungs. Immense satisfaction coursed through my pumping veins, and a warm sweat seeped from every aperture in my body as I absorbed the fruits of my labor. From my loins, that familiar and welcome arousal pulsated against my jeans. The corpse of Dennis Palmer laid at my feet as though nothing more than a darkened shadow. The dim glow of the moon seemed reluctant to venture anywhere near us, and chose instead to remain impartially distant from the wrath I had just inflicted. My heartbeat eventually began to slow down, and at that moment I suddenly began to feel strangely exposed. An icy cold seemed to have sneaked up on me without warning, and the warmth from my recent exertion swiftly faded away. Paranoia? A creeping and reaching sensation then caused the hair on my back to prickle as if in response to static. I glanced around in panic at the surrounding area. A bold silence filled the night, and my eyes observed nothing more than the stark formality of the darkened and uninhabited park. Other than Dennis lying dead at my feet, I was alone, but I began to notice something that profoundly unsettled me. My eyes widened in response to a slight movement from just below one of the trees back towards the entrance. Something unnatural stirred in the shadows underneath that tree. Something that's presence filled me with a severe and choking terror. As I watched in horror, the gloom seemed to swirl for a few moments before transforming into a more human-looking form. Whatever it was, it stood utterly and defiantly still as it gazed in my direction. I relaxed slightly, realizing that I was entirely bathed in the shade of the trees and therefore hidden from prying eyes. Even if I could be seen, maybe this unwelcome figure was just as fearful of my shadow as I was of its. But then it occurred to me, how long had it been standing there for? What if it had been watching me this whole time? Quietly and carefully, I stepped back behind the hedge and gazed back to where it stood. I couldn't see it from where I crouched, but I knew it had to still be there. Menacing eyes penetrated the silence without care for the darkness I tried to hide within. I sensed the sudden arrival of imminent doom as a voice inside me started to bellow. "Just run. Get out of here now." After killing Dennis, my original plan was to simply pull my hood up and jog back to the train station, where I had stashed a change of clothes in an old bag. After changing my clothes, I'd board the next train as though nothing had happened, the last train of the evening. A plan I'd deliberated over meticulously for months. However, that was all before I faced the possibility of a witness. Checking my watch, I only had 15 minutes until my train. I had to vacate the scene imminently. I noticed the dull sound of cars passing outside the park grounds behind me, which brought me back to the reality of the situation. It didn't matter if someone was indeed watching from nearby. That was the least of my worries. I had to run. Easing out from where I crouched, I rejoined the path before glancing back in the direction of my watcher. To my horror, it was still there, but it stood closer and much taller this time. Like any rational person in such a situation, I panicked, and for the first time I was consumed with real and abject fear. I spun around and sprinted as hard and fast as possible from that place. I raced under the trees and through those park gardens as though my life depended on it. Avoiding the main entrance, I crossed over the grass towards some railings hidden behind a thicket of bushes. My heart almost stopped as I turned my head one last time before climbing the fence. The shadow had followed me, but it stood entirely still upon my gaze, almost as though it was convinced I hadn't seen it yet. But I had. I vaulted over the fence and landed heavily on the pavement below. The street was empty in both directions, and I could hear the distant murmur of approaching cars, so I quickly crossed the road towards a side street to avoid being seen. I ran and ran and ran, continuing around several corners before my muscles began to burn. It wasn't until I slowed my pace to catch my breath that I noticed a cold breeze tickling my neck, which compelled me to turn around. Something lurked at the corner of the street I'd just departed. My heart froze as I recognized the presence that had followed me through the park. Once again it stopped confrontationally upon my gaze, but it was no longer just a faceless shadow. A streetlight above illuminated its form. What I saw caused a jolting scream of fear to blaze throughout my body as though I had been struck by lightning. The twisted face of Dennis Palmer grinned at me from under the streetlight with absolute malice protruding from his eyes. His face contorted terribly under the yellow glow from above. I'd been watching him for months. I knew how he moved. I knew the clothes he wore. But it just couldn't be. I killed him in the park. So what the hell was this? This just had to be my imagination. Eventually I managed to turn away from that madness, and I didn't stop running until I reached the train station. Tears ran down my face, and my insides burned like coals on a furnace. Eventually slowing to a fast stride, I swiftly entered the toilet and immediately vomited into one of the sinks. Checking my watch, I realized that I only had a few more minutes until my train. I was hesitant to waste any more time, so I made for the cubicle and stepped onto the cistern. Reaching inside the ceiling panel, I carefully removed my bag. After quickly changing into the clean outfit I'd prepared months earlier, I packed away my discarded clothing and placed the bag over my shoulder. Seconds later, I departed the toilet and headed straight for a seat I knew would be safe from any cameras in the station. I rechecked my watch. The train would be arriving at any moment. I forced a wry smile. I'd be home soon, and it would be as though none of this had ever happened. I just had to relax, and soon all of this would be over. As I tried to control my breathing, I could sense its threatening eyes gazing at me from the entrance to the station, but I couldn't turn in the direction of the stare. I wouldn't. I couldn't bear to see the eyes of Dennis Palmer staring back at me again. Instead, I tried to brush off this notion as fanciful. It just couldn't be real. Dennis Palmer lay dead in the park. This had to have been a figment of my imagination. Or maybe it was his ghost. My heart boomed in my chest like a bass drum. His presence remained steadfast and utterly menacing, no matter how hard I tried to relax and control my breathing. I could feel him glowering at me, and it occurred to me then that I was the one being stalked. Sweat trickled down my back as the long sinewy fingers of fear tickled my tingling skin. Deep breaths in and deep breaths out. The train finally approached, and I felt a surge of elation as it slowed to a halt right in front of me. I moved slowly enough to keep an eye on any sudden motion from my pursuer, whose eyes watched me with every step. But he didn't seem encouraged to follow. Instead, he just remained out of sight, and it wasn't until I was seated that I decided to glance in his direction to confirm if he was still there. The train doors closed, but my eyes never left the threatening gaze of Dennis Palmer, who watched me and the train pulling out of the station. In just over an hour, I was back outside my house, and suddenly everything seemed surreal, as though I'd been dreaming. Maybe killing Dennis had allowed me to access a twisted dimension, one that I was not yet conditioned enough to endure or comprehend. I dumped my bag of discarded clothing stealthily in one of the neighbors' bins before entering my front door and finally closing the night outside and behind me. Slumping against the door, I went back over every detail from the past few hours. Although shaken quite considerably at being followed, I couldn't help but feel proud of my achievements. A smile broadened across my face as I relived the events at the park, and I chuckled as my mind wandered back to the vivid memory of the altercations heard through the wall. Like my neighbor, I'd ventured into the unknown, to a previously unexplored dimension, so of course there would be consequences. I looked down at my hands that had recently strangled the life out of Dennis Palmer. Or had they? Somehow it all just didn't seem real. What happened has happened, and there's no turning back now. When my neighbor was arrested for his wife's murder, her body was carried into an ambulance as I watched. He was now spending the rest of his life in prison for his actions, but at least he knew it was real, all real. For my closure, I just needed the corpse of Dennis Palmer to be found, because that would confirm that whatever followed me was merely a figment of my imagination. That would make things authentic to me and help balance my fractured mind. This would all be over the news soon, and I could watch everything from the comfort of my home, protected once more by the concrete walls from the world on the other side. It had been a very long and exhausting day, but the work was now done, and I needed to keep things together. I stood up and noticed how weak and drained my body felt. Stretching my arms above my head, I yawned hard and decided it was time to get some sleep. I couldn't wait to close my eyes and face whatever vivid dreams lay in store. Grinning wildly, I skipped down the hall into the bathroom and switched on the lights. A scream immediately stuck in my throat like stubborn vomit that wouldn't shift. At the same time, a sharp gasp came from the face in the mirror as I stared into its manic and terrifying pale blue eyes. Immediately panicking, I lifted my hand to my face to try and conceal the reflection, just for a moment, before slowly sliding my fingers down and past my eyes. Oh, dear God, no. Dennis Palmer gazed back defiantly from the mirror in front of me. His smile stretched widely from cheek to cheek, and I completely lost control. I smashed the mirror with my fists until my hands were bloody, and the broken remnants stared back at me stubbornly from below. His terrible face leered at me from every shard of glass. Dennis Palmer's face, not mine. But how could this be? He grinned at me from every broken fragment scattered on the toilet floor, and his laugh bellowed triumphantly in my ears. Within that moment, everything became clear. I'd not just opened the door to whatever lurks behind the veil of existence. I'd wandered into unknown realms. This experience was merely a symptom of the aftermath and the effect of exposure to this uncharted void. It was all simply too much for my unacclimatized mind to comprehend. My now broken mind, fractured just like the mirror on the floor. I closed my eyes and focused on my deep breathing exercises, and that's when the answer presented itself. If I couldn't see what was before me, it couldn't make me go crazy. I used the longest shard of glass to pierce my eyes. The pain was staggering, and I passed out several times before finishing my brutal operation. Blood seeped and squirted from my sockets as I continued to dig the glass in and around to scoop out as much tissue and sinew as possible until I could see no more. And then, with absolute bliss, I retired into a deep and glorious sleep. I laugh in delight as my recollection now comes to an end. Alone in the darkness of the quiet and peaceful nights, my body trembles as I ponder my absolute stroke of genius. The pain is excruciating, but I smile proudly at my achievement. To think of something so precarious just proves how conditioned I am now. And even though I can still smell the faint odor of Dennis and sense his foul presence, I would never again feel his gaze upon me. It would drive him mad to know this, wouldn't it? But not me. Oh no, not me. I destroyed my own eyes to prevent myself from going mad. Would a mad person even consider doing that? I think not. You see, I'm not mad. And every now and then, a story comes along and makes you think, what on earth was that I just read? And that is definitely one of those stories. Started recording that one a couple of weeks ago. It took me a while to get to the end of it. And that's mainly because I massively misjudged how long it was going to take to do the final Meat Locust story. So that is going to be with you next weekend. It's about 2.5 hours, and I just didn't get anywhere near finishing it in time for this Sunday. So my apologies there. I know I promised it to you. But it is coming, it is. It really is. But hope you enjoyed that weird and wonderful tale for this Sunday evening. Back again tomorrow with something else weirder and wonderfuler. So until then, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.